right, we've been talking about the mechanisms of evolution, so how evolution takes place, how populations can change over time. I'm going to add to that definition and say that evolution is a change in the allele frequencies of a population over time. So what are these allele frequencies? So we've already talked about alleles. Let's talk about the lab that we're doing this week, and we look at the beetles, and they have different color alleles. For example, there's blue, there's red, there's black, there's white, and there's even more. Each one of those are different alleles. So some of the beetles that you see, they look white, but they have a red allele. So that would be a recessive allele. Some of them have two red alleles, let's say, and they do look red. Now, when we talk about allele frequencies, we have to also count in there those recessive alleles that are not showing in the phenotype. So allele frequencies are going to be a little more complicated than saying just the population changes over time. How many of those alleles are in a population over time? So if we start out with 50% red alleles and 50% white alleles, and over time we end up with 90% red and 10% white, then we know that evolution has occurred because there's been a change in the allele frequencies over time. Now, natural selection is not the only mechanism of evolution. It's all we've talked about so far, really, but it's not the only mechanism. Now, it is the only mechanism that will lead to adaptations to an environment. So remember those adaptations we talked about where the mouse was blending into the environment? That's only one type of adaptation, but that occurs because of natural selection. So the environment is selecting, and after natural selection and evolution by natural selection, then you can end up with a population that is adapted to a certain environment. Now there's other mechanisms of evolution that we've talked about and that you've seen in the 5-finger video. Make sure you watch the 5 Fingers of Evolution video. It's so good. It's one of my favorites. So we know that natural selection is not the only mechanism. There's also mutations. So in your lab, you change the mutation rates. That also changed the evolution of the populations. Then you have something called genetic drift, which we're going to talk about more in a minute. But it happens when you have very small populations. And I'll give you examples of that in just a minute. You also have migration or gene flow, where you have populations that can mate together. And mating, so whether there's mating is random or non-random. Non-random mating, like selective mating, that is going to result in evolution as well. So population genetics is the study of this diversity in terms of allele differences. There's math involved in this, and we usually go over that, but because of time and the different structure this semester, we're going to go ahead and skip that part. But I am going to talk about what that math would be, but we're not going to do it together. I'll show you. Okay, so we've talked about allele frequencies. This is going to be the proportion of each allele within a population's gene pool. Again, watch the 5 Fingers of Evolution video. I think it'll make things really clear for you as well. Now, when allele frequencies are changing in a population, so when those beetles that you do in your lab go from white to blue, let's say, that's actually microevolution. Microevolution is any change in allele frequencies in a population. So that's microevolution, meaning the beetles may have changed alleles, but they can still mate with other beetles. They're not completely different species. This is not speciation. This is just a change in a population over time. Okay, so that's microevolution. Now, macroevolution, M-A-C-R-O, macro is a large evolution. That means that leads to speciation. That's where you have two completely different species that are so different in their alleles that they can no longer mate. So I'll show you that as well. Okay, so the math that I referred to, that's actually called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And it states that allele frequencies in a population will remain constant, assuming no mutations, no gene flow, random mating, no genetic drift, no selection, and you know this is not ever the case. Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium required conditions are rarely, if ever, met. This is just not what happens in the world. Deviations from a Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium indicate that evolution has taken place. So what this means is evolution is always taking place. Microevolution is always taking place within populations. Here's a chart to show you. So a deviation from a condition would be non-random mating. You have selection occurring, whether it's natural or artificial. This one's showing natural. You have mutations, immigration or emigration, and small populations due to bottleneck effect or founder effect, which we're going to talk about. Okay, make sure you look over that chart. So, causes of microevolution. Genetic mutations. We've seen that mutations occur randomly in a population. They provide new alleles that the environment can act upon. Not only the environment, but also things like sexual selection, so mating. Some mutations might be more adaptive than others. When we're talking about adaptive, we're talking about natural selection. So genetic mutations affecting pigment color in the peppered moths. They provided the variation needed for natural selection to occur. Then you have gene flow, so a movement of alleles between populations. Gametes or seeds are carried into another population, and breeding individuals move into or out of a population. So this used to be a population of green beetles, and this was a population of brown beetles. When one individual immigrated into this population right here, that added another allele to this population. So that definitely changed the allele frequency. And microevolution occurred. Now, if they were separate over time, and this brown population never ever mated with this green population and vice versa, eventually their alleles may become so different because they are not exchanging genes or alleles between populations. They might become so different that they can no longer mate. Once that has occurred, that is macroevolution, and you will have a new species. They can no longer breed together. Okay, what is genetic drift? Genetic drift occurs when something like a natural disaster might happen. So this is a stand of trees, and forest fire is going to kill off, looks like 20% of the population. If a forest fire kills off 20% of the population, that's a huge chunk. And that will lead to a change in allele frequencies because it's been randomly just randomly killed off 20% of those moths, completely changing the allele frequencies. There's also something called founder's effect, and that's going to be where just a few individuals may leave a population and go colonize another environment. When that happens, there's just a small assortment of the alleles represented in this new population. So that's definitely changed both of these allele frequencies, both the ones that have left and the ones that were founded. It's called a bottleneck when just a few individuals are randomly put into a new population, whether it be by a natural disaster or a founder's effect, because it's random, just which few are poured out of this bottleneck. Which few alleles are going to be represented in this new environment. So after a bottleneck, there may be severe inbreeding because there's not going to be a lot of individuals to mate with. So the effects are going to be much stronger. Okay, non-random mating. One really fun one to look up is the blue-footed booby. Look up a video about the blue-footed boobies mating. They do a mating dance. It's really, really fun to watch. And that's how they select their mates. Now, this is going to be non-random mating. They're selecting a mate. They're not just randomly picking. So, for example, this beetle right here, if it would have the same chance of mating with any one of these other beetles of different colors, then that would be non-random mating. But if this beetle would only mate with other beetles of the same color, then that is non-random mating. Does that make sense? I think I said that wrong. This one's random, this one's non-random. Okay, so let's go back to natural selection again. Natural selection is a major cause of microevolution. it does result in a change in allele frequencies, but not just in a change in allele frequencies, it actually leads to adaptations to the environment. Now, there's 3 different types of natural selection that we talk about. There's directional selection that is going to cause a population to go towards one extreme or another. I'll show you an example. I think it's the next slide. Yeah, human birth weight, for example, is going to be towards one extreme or another. So the percentage of births in a population, you can see that the birth weight of human babies, it cannot be too small because then they won't survive, as they're not as likely to survive being too small. And they can't be too big because then they're not as likely to be born to survive the actual birth. So there's this medium birth weight that is favorable for survival. That's going to be directional that's stabilizing selection. I'm very sorry, because it's the medium here. So it's this in the middle is the most favorable. Right here, that's stabilizing selection. I've got these backwards. Okay, so then the next one is going to be directional selection. And this one is going to be antibiotic resistance bacteria. So if we have this initial distribution here, over time, we add antibiotics. Over time, they're going to form this resistance to antibiotics. So at first, there's only just a few that are resistant to the antibiotics. But over time, because all of the others are killed off, then almost all of them are now resistant to the antibiotics. This is what has led to MRSA, multiple resistant strain of antibiotics. MRSA is caused by this microevolution here, this directional selection from natural selection. And then the last one is going to be disruptive selection. And this one you can see really well in the shells of snails. So the banding patterns versus the number of individuals. So this has to do with non-random mating. The snails are actually going to mate more with different banding patterns than they are with the center not as banded. Sorry, I'm trying to hurry so I can get through this for you guys before my time is up. Okay, so this is the sexual selection. Let's look at sexual selection. I've already told you about the blue-footed booby. Definitely look up that video. It's great. There's also a video about a bowerbird. This one's worth clicking on too. You have these slides in your content section under Unit 5 slides. Click on the bowerbird and watch that video. The bowerbird actually decorates its nest to attract mates. So that's pretty cool. Puts all kinds of trinkets and stuff to make a mate come, and it shows how well the bowerbird is able to scavenge. And then you have many animals that will show fierceness to show that they can be protective. And then you have birds that have bright coloring. That bright coloring is actually a measure of its fitness. Okay, let's see what else I wanted to talk about. Okay, so we need to make sure that the reason that we worry about habitat loss, and we need to keep diversity. Why are we worried about habitat loss and biodiversity? Well, biodiversity is going to keep different alleles in the population. And remember, natural selection relies on there being different alleles to select for, because some may be favorable and some may not be. And as the environment changes, we need to make sure that we have different alleles that natural selection can act on, instead of just wiping out complete populations, entire populations. So threats to biodiversity are things like habitat loss. This is a coral reef when it's healthy. It's very biodiverse, has a whole bunch of different species, different alleles available there. And then after the bleaching of this coral reef, it's just everything was devastated. Also, invasive species are a big threat for biodiversity because they just take over. This is actually honeysuckle, and it takes over entire understories so nothing else can grow, wiping out any biodiversity there. I have to end this. I miss you guys.